It was supposed to be a simple getaway. 3 friends, Jason, Mark, and Lisa, decided to spend a week camping in the remote forests of Kansas, far away from the noise of city life. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just fresh air, campfires, and the kind of peace you can only find in nature. But as soon as they arrived, something felt off. Jason, the one who suggested the trip, was the first to notice it. He arrived a few hours before Mark and Lisa, and as he set up the camp near a small, bubbling creek, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He shrugged it off, blaming it on the unfamiliar quiet of the forest. When Mark and Lisa finally arrived, they seemed more excited than anything else, cracking jokes and setting up the fire pit. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, everything seemed normal again. They gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows, laughing, and reminiscing about old times. Jason felt the tension in his chest loosen as the warmth of the fire and his friends' laughter started to ease his mind. But something still lingered in the back of his thoughts. The woods were too still, too silent. As the night grew darker, Lisa wandered away from the campfire, saying she needed a bathroom break. Jason, who had been feeling uneasy, told her to hurry back. The woods were dangerous at night, full of predators and strange sounds. But as soon as Lisa disappeared into the trees, the air around the campfire seemed to grow colder. Mark noticed it too, and for a moment, the two of them sat in uncomfortable silence. "Do you hear that?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, barely above a whisper. Jason leaned in closer, listening. There was something like footsteps, soft and almost inaudible, just beyond the firelight. Jason frowned, trying to locate the sound, but the forest around them was pitch black, and the trees seemed to close in with every passing second. "I don't know, man. Probably just some animal," Jason replied, though he wasn't convinced. He had grown up camping, and he had never heard anything like that. But before either of them could speak again, Lisa returned, her face pale, her steps quick. "You okay?" Jason asked, standing up to meet her. Lisa didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared at him, her eyes wide with something between confusion and fear. She began, but then she trailed off, looking over her shoulder like she was expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, rising from his seat and stepping toward her. "I swear," Lisa said, her voice trembling, "I saw something out there in the woods. A person, maybe, or something else. But it wasn't just an animal. It was standing there, watching me." Jason's stomach dropped. He thought he had heard something too, but Lisa's words hit him harder than the strange noise. He knew the forest could play tricks on you, but Lisa didn't strike him as the type to exaggerate. "Are you sure?" Jason asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Maybe it was just a shadow or some animal moving through the trees, but Lisa shook her head vigorously. "No, it wasn't like that. I saw its face, and it was watching me like it knew who I was." Jason didn't know what to say. He wanted to reassure her, but he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut that something was wrong, really wrong. The night passed uneventfully after that, but Jason couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel the presence in the trees, just beyond the fire's reach. The darkness outside the camp seemed to press in closer. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just paranoia. But when he woke up the next morning, something wasn't right. The forest was quieter. There was no wind, no birds, no rustling in the leaves, just silence. Jason tried to ignore it, forcing himself to focus on the day's activities. But even as they hiked deeper into the forest, something kept pulling at the edge of his mind. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something, and that something, Jason was beginning to suspect, was not good. This story seems to be getting scarier, doesn't it? If you want more stories like this, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. This helps create even more scary for you. The next day, the unease didn't let up. Lisa kept her distance, walking a little too close to the campfire whenever they stopped for a break. Jason noticed that Mark, usually the most laid-back of the group, was quiet, almost distracted. It wasn't like him to be so withdrawn. There was a palpable tension in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Despite their growing discomfort, they pressed on. They spent the day hiking through the dense trees, but no matter how far they went, They couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was different. It wasn't like the other woods they'd hiked in before, where birds and squirrels skittered across the path, and the trees whispered in the wind. This place felt suffocating, as if the woods were swallowing the noise, choking it out, leaving only an unsettling silence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew long, the group gathered by the campfire once more. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a thin mist began to creep in, curling between the trees like ghostly fingers. Jason felt it again, the feeling of being watched. His eyes darted nervously around the clearing, but he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Mark broke the silence first, his voice a little too loud in the quiet night. "You guys ever feel like we're not alone out here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the trees. Lisa nodded. "I swear, last night, I saw something, but it wasn't a person, it was wrong." Jason opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a sound shattered the calm. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the edge of the camp. It wasn't the usual rustle of animals. This was the unmistakable sound of human steps, heavy and purposeful. Jason froze, his heart racing. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Mark and Lisa both nodded, their faces drained of color. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer to the camp, until they were just beyond the light of the fire. "Who's there?" Jason called out, trying to sound confident, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. There was no answer, just the sound of heavy breathing. Mark reached for the flashlight in his backpack, but as he turned it on, the beam flickered and died. "Shit," he muttered, trying to make it work, but it was useless. The darkness around them was complete now, swallowing the light. Suddenly, Lisa let out a sharp cry, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. "There, do you see it?" Jason's heart skipped a beat as he turned to follow her finger. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he saw something moving, something tall, standing just out of the light. In the trees, a figure. Its face was hidden, but its eyes, shiny, dark, and too large, seemed to reflect the firelight, staring straight at them. Before he could speak, the figure vanished into the mist, leaving only the haunting echo of its footsteps behind. "What the hell was that?" Mark gasped, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Jason said, trying to steady his breath. "But we need to get out of here." The night passed in tense silence. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, from the cracking of twigs to the distant howl of a coyote. They huddled in their tents, unwilling to venture out again. Jason's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had seen. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being stalked, followed by something that wasn't human. By morning, the fear had settled like a thick fog, and Jason couldn't sleep. He lay in his tent, wide-eyed, waiting for the sun to rise, but it didn't make him feel any safer. There was something ancient about this place, something that seemed to breathe and shift beneath the earth. When the sun finally came up, it didn't feel like the same day. The forest was darker somehow, even under the pale morning light. After breakfast, they decided to head back to their original campsite and pack up early, but when they arrived, they were met with a horrifying sight. Lisa's bag was gone, and not just her bag, everything. Her sleeping bag, her tent, her jacket, all of it had vanished without a trace. "What the hell?" Jason murmured, stepping into the empty campsite. His voice was tight with fear. "This doesn't make any sense." Mark looked around, his face pale. "Maybe she went off on her own, but why wouldn't she tell us?" "She wouldn't leave without saying something," Jason said. "She was freaked out last night. She wouldn't just disappear." The forest around them felt unnaturally still, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. Jason's stomach twisted into knots. It wasn't just the strange events of the previous night, it was the way the forest seemed to close in on them. It was like the woods themselves were alive, aware of their presence, playing a game with them. "We need to find her," Mark said, his voice desperate. "We need to go after her." Jason nodded, but deep down, a horrible thought began to creep into his mind. What if they weren't meant to find her? The forest seemed to close in on them as Jason and Mark trudged through the trees, searching for any sign of Lisa. Every shadow seemed to twist and writhe. Every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps. Jason tried to calm himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something far worse than a simple prank or a lost friend. The woods weren't just silent, they were watching. Where could she have gone? Mark asked, his voice low and tight with fear. She didn't just vanish. She has to be here somewhere. Jason's mind raced. The thought that Lisa could have simply walked off on her own didn't sit right with him. She was scared last night. She wouldn't have just left. And if something had happened to her, well, they needed to find her fast. But where could she have gone in the middle of the night? In the dark, with no warning? The answer came to him in a flash. She hadn't left. She had been taken. Jason gripped the strap of his backpack tighter, trying to ignore the creeping feeling of dread that curled in his chest. They had to keep going. They had to keep searching. As they pressed deeper into the woods, the silence around them became unbearable. The trees were unnaturally still, the air thick with an unspoken weight. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the entire forest holding its breath, like some unseen force was waiting for them to make a move. Mark's voice snapped Jason from his thoughts. "Look!" Jason turned, following Mark's gaze. There, on the ground in front of them, was a trail, a faint, barely visible path of broken twigs and disturbed leaves. It was as if someone had been dragged through the underbrush. Jason's stomach churned. It was too perfect, too deliberate. "Lisa," Jason called, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound calm. "If that's you, we're coming. Just hang on." But there was no answer, only the rustling of the trees. They followed the trail for what felt like hours, until the sun had sunk low in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The path led them deeper into the woods, far away from their original campsite. Every now and then, Jason thought he saw something in the distance, just a flicker, a shadow moving too quickly to be anything natural. But when he turned to look, it was gone. "This is wrong," Mark muttered, breaking the silence. "This is way wrong. We shouldn't be here." Jason didn't respond. He couldn't. He felt the same way, but he had to keep moving. They had no choice now. They were too far into this to turn back. The trail led them to an old, decaying structure, a small cabin, barely more than a ruin now, hidden in the deep woods. It looked abandoned, the walls sagging and weathered, the roof caving in places. But as Jason approached, something about the cabin sent a shiver up his spine. It was as if it had been waiting for them. "Do you think she's in there?" Mark asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jason nodded slowly. "I don't know, but we're going in." The door to the cabin was hanging off its hinges, the wood creaking as Jason pushed it open. The inside was dark, the air thick with mildew and the scent of decay. Jason's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the empty space. But then, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement, just beyond the corner of the room. "Lisa," Jason called, his voice shaking. But again, there was no response, only silence. They stepped inside, Mark's footsteps heavy behind him. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly moved deeper into the cabin, his flashlight flickering with each step. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and the air felt colder, like they were walking into something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. As they reached the back of the cabin, Jason froze. On the far wall, scratched into the wood, were symbols, strange, unrecognizable marks, like something from an ancient language. They were arranged in a circle, surrounding something in the center. Jason leaned in closer, his flashlight illuminating the marks, when he noticed something else. In the center of the circle was a single, faded photograph. It was old, yellowed with age, and framed by more of those strange symbols. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the faces in the photo. It was Lisa, and in the background, just barely visible, were two figures standing in the shadows. They were blurry, but Jason could make out enough to know they were not human. Their faces were twisted and wrong, like something from a nightmare. Mark saw it too. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, stepping back in horror. Jason didn't answer. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't just a missing person case. It was something much worse. They had stumbled into something far older, something far darker than either of them could have imagined. Suddenly, a noise from behind them made them both freeze. It was faint at first, just a whisper, barely audible over the sound of their breathing, but then it grew louder, like the rustling of feet moving across the floor. Something was coming. Before they could react, a figure stepped into the doorway, its face hidden in the shadows, but Jason could feel it. It was watching them, staring, and then, in a voice that sent ice through his veins, the figure spoke. "Leave, now, or you'll never leave." Jason's heart pounded in his chest as the figure in the doorway remained motionless, its form cloaked in shadows. The air seemed to thicken around them, and for a moment, Jason wondered if he was hallucinating. But no, the figure was real. He could feel it, feel its presence in the very marrow of his bones. "Who are you?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible, as though the mere act of speaking might provoke the figure. The figure didn't answer right away. It simply stood there, unmoving, staring at them with unseen eyes. Jason felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as the oppressive silence filled the room. It was as if time itself had frozen. "Leave," the figure rasped again, its voice hollow, like the wind whispering through a long-abandoned house. "You are not welcome here." Jason felt an icy chill run through his veins. He knew they had to leave. The strange symbols on the wall, the photograph of Lisa, the eerie presence in the cabin, it was all wrong. But something deep inside him, a primal, instinctual fear, told him that leaving now might not even be an option. Something had been waiting for them here. Something ancient. Something that wasn't going to let them go so easily. "Where is she?" Jason demanded, his voice shaking but firm. "Where is Lisa?" The figure stepped forward into the weak light, and for the first time, Jason could make out its features, or rather, what should have been its features. It was human in shape, but its face was wrong. The skin was too pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow, black as night, reflecting nothing but emptiness. "You should not have come," the figure said, its voice now laced with something deeper, more guttural. "It was never meant for you." Before Jason could respond, the figure moved, not like a person, but like something else, something that didn't belong to this world. It was fast, too fast for human eyes to track, and in the blink of an eye, it was gone, vanishing into the darkness of the cabin as if it had never been there at all. Jason and Mark stood frozen, their bodies stiff with terror. The only sound was the beating of their own hearts in their chests. "What the hell was that?" Mark asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, as though he was afraid to speak too loudly. Jason didn't know. He couldn't explain it, but he knew one thing: whatever that thing was, it wasn't the first, and it wasn't alone. "We need to get out of here," Jason said, his voice tight with fear. He turned quickly, heading for the door, but before they could make it, a low, guttural sound rumbled from the shadows of the cabin. It was a growl, deep and inhuman, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air itself. Then, a sudden crash, something large moving quickly through the darkness behind them. Jason spun around, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement, something large, something wrong. It was not a man, it was not an animal, it was a shape, a hulking figure, moving with a twisted grace, its long arms scraping along the floor as it came closer. Closer. "Run!" Jason screamed. They bolted for the door, but as they reached it, the wooden frame splintered, and the door slammed shut with an unnatural force, trapping them inside. The growl grew louder, a roar of fury and hunger that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. Mark turned to Jason, his eyes wide with panic. "What the hell is that thing?" Jason didn't have an answer. He didn't need one. All he knew was that they had to survive. They had to get out of there before whatever that thing was, whatever was chasing them, got to them first. As they scrambled toward the back window, Jason's heart stopped. Lisa's face, pale, her eyes wide with terror, appeared in the darkness outside, pressed up against the glass, her hands reaching out. She looked as though she was begging for help. "Lisa!" Mark shouted, but Jason could see the terror in his eyes. It wasn't just fear for their friend, it was something else. Something far deeper, a fear of the unknown. Jason's hand reached for the window, but before he could touch it, the sound of movement, heavy, slow, deliberate, came from the other side. Something was getting closer, something that didn't belong, and then, As Jason stared in disbelief, the figure outside shifted. Lisa's face warped, her features distorting into something monstrous, her skin stretching as if something was pulling at it from the inside. "No! Get away from the window!" Jason screamed, grabbing Mark by the arm, pulling him away. But it was too late. The window shattered as the thing, whatever it was, lunged through it. Its twisted, gnarled hand reaching for them. It had taken Lisa, and now it was coming for them. Jason and Mark didn't look back. They ran. The forest was alive around them. The trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting like claws, grabbing at their clothes. The ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as if it was shifting with each step. They heard footsteps behind them, too heavy, too fast to be human, and the sound of ragged breathing, so close they could almost feel it on their necks. Jason's lungs burned, his legs felt like lead, but still, they ran. And then, just when he thought they couldn't go any further, they broke through the trees into a clearing. Jason dared to glance back, but there was nothing, no figure, no growls. The forest stood still, silent again. Jason's heart was still hammering in his chest, but they were alive. For now. But as he looked around, he realized they weren't alone. There was something in the clearing with them, something waiting, something watching, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The clearing was deceptively calm. Jason's heart was still racing, his breath shallow as he scanned the trees around them. The eerie silence hung in the air like a thick fog, stifling and unnatural. They had barely escaped the cabin, but whatever had followed them into the woods wasn't done. They were just biding their time, waiting. "Where do we go now?" Mark gasped, his voice strained. His eyes darted frantically around the clearing, as though he expected the trees themselves to come alive and swallow him whole. Jason didn't have an answer. They had to keep moving, keep running, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever, its vastness swallowing them whole. The forest wasn't like the one they had hiked through when they first arrived. This place felt ancient, its darkness an entity in itself. Jason could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him with each breath. "We can't stay here," Jason said, his voice hoarse. "We need to find a way out. There's got to be an exit, a road or something. Just keep moving." Mark nodded, though his expression was one of despair. It was clear he was struggling to hold it together. The terror was palpable, and Jason could see the fear creeping into his eyes. Before they could take another step, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. It wasn't the wind they were used to, the usual rustling of leaves. No, this wind was like a voice, a whisper carried on the breeze, just beyond their hearing. Jason's skin crawled. "Do you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. Jason nodded grimly. He didn't need to hear it to know what it was. It was the same whispering voice they'd heard the night Lisa disappeared. The same voice that seemed to carry a warning, but always just out of reach, like it was trying to tell them something important, but they couldn't understand it. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet, as though something massive was moving just below the surface. The trees groaned, their limbs swaying despite the lack of wind. And then, from the darkness beyond the clearing, a shadow appeared, a shape, enormous and shifting, moving with the same unnatural grace that the figure in the cabin had exhibited. Jason's breath caught in his throat. It was the thing, the creature, and it wasn't alone. From the shadows, more figures began to emerge, tall, hunched, their forms flickering in and out of existence like distorted reflections in broken glass. Their eyes gleamed with a pale, sickly light. There were too many to count, their movements fluid and terrifying, as though they existed outside the realm of time and space. They weren't human, they weren't anything Jason had ever seen before. They were something else. Mark stumbled backward, his face contorted with fear. "What are they?" he whispered, his voice a strangled breath. Jason didn't have the words. He could feel it deep inside, an ancient terror that shook him to the core. These were the things that had been hunting them. These were the creatures that had taken Lisa, and now, they were coming for him and Mark. Jason grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the far side of the clearing. "Run!" he shouted, his voice raw with panic. "Run!" They sprinted through the trees, the ground underfoot shaking with every step the creatures took. Behind them, the sound of footsteps, too many, too fast, followed, growing louder with each passing second. Jason could feel them closing in, the hot breath of the beasts on the back of his neck. He had no idea where they were going, no idea how to escape. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a light, a faint glow, flickering through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The edge of the forest, a road, the last hope. "We're almost there," Jason yelled. But before they could take another step, one of the creatures lunged, blocking their path. It was enormous, easily 10 feet tall, its body twisting unnaturally as it reached out with long, clawed hands. Its face was a mask of horror, eyes too wide and hollow, a mouth full of jagged teeth that seemed to stretch into the very sky. Jason froze, his blood running cold. The creature was so close now he could feel its breath hot, fetid, like decay and rot. It opened its mouth, a scream of pure rage and hunger bursting from its throat. But just as it lunged for them, Mark did something unexpected. He shoved Jason aside, knocking him to the ground. "No!" Jason shouted, scrambling to his feet. But it was too late. Mark was already being pulled into the creature's jaws. The scream that ripped from Mark's throat echoed through the woods, a sound of pure terror, but it was quickly drowned out by the creature's growl. Jason watched in horror as Mark was swallowed whole, the creature's massive mouth snapping shut. Jason could do nothing but stare. He couldn't move. The world around him blurred as his body went numb. His friend, his best friend, was gone. But there was no time for grief, no time for shock. The other creatures were closing in. They were surrounding him. Jason turned, his legs moving without thinking, running toward the light. The roar of the creature behind him was deafening, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He had to get out. He had to survive. The trees thinned as Jason pushed through them, finally bursting into a small clearing. And there it was, his salvation. A dirt road, lined with trees, disappearing into the distance. He ran toward it, his heart pounding in his chest. The creatures were still behind him, but they didn't dare come any closer. It was as if an invisible barrier kept them at bay. Jason didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He kept running until he could barely breathe, until his legs felt like they might give out under him. But he didn't stop, not until he reached the road, not until he saw headlights in the distance, approaching fast. A car, a light, people. He was saved. But as the car pulled up beside him, Jason's relief was short-lived. He looked inside, only to find the driver, Lisa. Her face was pale and emotionless, her eyes empty, lifeless. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice empty. "It was never meant for you." And then the world around Jason went black. If you enjoyed this terrifying story, don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for more spine-chilling content. Your support helps the video reach more viewers and brings even more horror to your screen.